Hello and welcome to the Political Opinions podcast, where every opinion is given equal footing and political tolerance and debate are given their proper attention in a world where both are on the decline. Today's episode will cover different opinions on universal basic income. Now, universal basic income, or UBI for short, is essentially an idea that everyone in a state should receive a set amount of money. This could be, for example, every citizen of the United States receives $10,000 a year from the US federal government. Many people propose UBI as a general solution, if you will, to approaching many different issues modern society faces. As always, however, there are a number of drawbacks to UBI. So today we will unpack and compare these opinions. Despite perhaps sounding new, UBI is relatively similar to many other taxation programs, particularly in the idea that it is a form of redistribution. It goes without saying that a universal basic income is going to be just a tad expensive, and as such, taxes are going to be needed quite heavily to fund it. And with any form of, say, income taxation, the rich pay far more than poorer people do. Put simply, a rich person could be paying, say, £1 million a year in income tax, and that could be more than 1,000 people only paying £1,000 a year in income tax, for a very general example. The benefit here is that with universal basic income, the particularly rich paying the most tax are going to be going towards everyone, and it means it's a very effective means of reducing the wealth gap through distribution. Now, this distribution also has the added benefit of reducing poverty. If everyone in the country, or at least every citizen, is getting an income, it's going to be very difficult to have a situation such as we have today, where you have homeless people, those in huge amounts of debt with no income. With everyone having access to a basic level of income, they should at least be able to afford food and shelter at the bare minimum, which is a great stepping stone towards eliminating poverty in the modern world altogether. It was not just poor people who would benefit as well. Universal basic income could greatly benefit the economy nationwide. Firstly, all those people who have to leave education in order to work because they need the money now, they are the people who may suffer later from a lack of qualifications. But if they have a basic income, meaning they are able to stay in education and still cover their general life costs, it means there will be a more educated population, which will be very beneficial, particularly in Western societies where we are moving towards quaternary sector work, essentially meaning it is providing services. It is intellectual, not so much manual labour anymore. And we can't, of course, ignore the other benefit, that there's going to be a lot more disposable income. Everyone's going to have that bit more money, particularly if you have a job, you're going to have far more disposable income, which you can spend in businesses, firms and elsewhere in the economy, and that circulation of cash can help promote economic growth. Speaking of those who work, universal basic income is an effective means to reducing employee exploitation. If you have a guaranteed source of income to fall back on at all times, you're not going to take work that may be exploiting you. For example, the firms that work you very long hours and don't pay you that much, or even if they do pay you well, if you have to piss in a bottle, Amazon, is not particularly enjoyable. But if you have that income to fall back on, it means there's a more general source of support. And it also empowers generally unpaid roles. For example, permanent family caregivers, stay-at-home parents who are looking after their children. These people don't get a wage generally, but if they receive universal basic income, it gives them more financial freedom. Now, all of this kind of misses the key point of universal basic income because a lot of different sources of money could do the same job. What universal basic income does is it simplifies the welfare state and social security. For example, no more do we have to have 10 different types of benefit for every single different person who has different needs, different complications and so on. Instead, everyone gets the same amount. And it also removes the stigma of benefits. Many people on benefits and other forms of support are often looked down upon because they receive support from the state. But if everyone's receiving it, then it is more fair. And speaking of fair, that is the last point. Universal basic income to many people is fair, because everyone benefits the same amount. You cannot claim you are not benefiting from it, because you will be receiving money for it, and everyone gets the same, which is really the most fair some people would say you can ask for. Now, despite all these benefits to universal basic income, there are a number of drawbacks which may make it far less attractive. Firstly, when it comes to redistribution, it's not as clear-cut as some might say. For example, rich people are still receiving the money. So you're not simply taking from the rich to give to the poor, you're taking from the rich to give back to the rich, admittedly in a much lower amount, but they are still receiving that money, which they wouldn't be had you had something like benefits, for example. And some would say just to redistribute for the sake of it is wrong. If someone has earned their money and worked hard for it, why should they have to lose a lot of it to go to someone who is lazy? Which is a point we'll get onto later. Then, when it comes to poverty, there's no guarantee universal basic income would essentially solve it entirely, or at least as well as some might hope. For example, UBI would require a tax hike. There's really no other way to pay for it. And that means poorer people who are working and paying taxes will suffer as a result. And if you put up something such as VAT, which is a tax that impacts poorer people more because they use more disposable income when they are buying things, that's even worse. There could also be the risk of reducing funding for other essential services. Just because we're spending less on certain types of welfare doesn't mean that we're not taking money from, say, bus services. What if now people say, okay, everyone has to pay for their bus fare? If you don't have the money to cover that, whereas before it was free, that could also cause problems. Now, we can't ignore the main issue with universal basic income at this point, which is that it's very expensive. Let's just put it that way. If you're paying everyone in the country, even something a low amount, such as say £5,000 a year, still quite a lot of money. And as such, it could easily lead to both inflation and government budget problems. Firstly, on the budget problems, we either have tax rises or spending cuts elsewhere, both of which could cause unintended consequences, as I've said before. Furthermore, if everyone has a massive amount of disposable income to spend, that means there's going to be inflation. We can't just start printing money and giving it to everyone. There has to be a balance elsewhere in the economy, and that balance might not be where people want it to. Then on the question of how does it impact workers negatively, because it might seem to be positive, well, there are two key points. First of all, universal basic income reduces the incentive to work. It doesn't empower people to avoid exploitation, it means they'll just become lazy. If you're guaranteed £10,000 or dollars a year for doing nothing, and you ultimately don't need the money, a lot of people would simply say, I'm not going to work anymore. And that could cause a lot of problems. There could be a labour shortage, there could be a shortage in a number of lower paid but still essential roles. If all the cleaners quit because they don't need to work anymore because they're getting paid a similar amount, it's going to be a bit dirty, isn't it? And also, companies could use universal basic income as an excuse to pay lower wages. Of course, the minimum wage would likely not remain if universal basic income was installed. It just wouldn't be economically viable, and in a situation such as that, let's say you were earning $15,000 a year beforehand. Now you get $10,000 on basic income, so they cut you down to $5,000 a year. Now you're working for far less money. Yes, you have money elsewhere, but it lowers the value of your work and means that there is a potential for you to actually have less income in the future, particularly if any of it is taxed. Then on the point of the welfare state, universal basic income would simplify the welfare state, but it would also be far more wasteful. Currently, yes, it's complicated and there are abuses of the system, but generally, the money only goes to people who need it. With universal basic income, however, the money's going to everyone. Suddenly, people who are earning 100 grand a year are receiving money that would previously have gone to someone making £5,000 a year and needed assistance. Situations such as this would become far more common, which is something we don't want. And then finally, perhaps the main criticism, at least I think it is, it's unfair for taxpayers to be funding everyone. People who work and then are taxed to pay for people who do not work, to some, is considered morally wrong. And yes, you could say it's fair that everyone receives the same, but you forget that there is a cost involved, and it's unfair for some people to pay for, essentially, for others to live off their hard-earned money. And that really is the core criticism. Not only does it incentivize people to be lazy, but it allows them to do so by having other people pay for it. Moving on now to the comparison. On the question of redistribution, some say it does redistribute. You take from the rich and give to the poor, reducing the wealth gap. Others, however, would say that both rich people still receive universal basic income, and that redistribution just for the sake of it is not good. On the question of how it impacts poverty, some believe it reduces poverty by ensuring everyone has access to money. Everyone will have at least a little amount to go towards food and shelter, and we won't have problems like homelessness. Others, however, would say that with tax hikes, there would be negative impacts for poorer wage earners, and with cuts to funding elsewhere, poverty problems could simply be masked by universal basic income. On the question of how it impacts the economy, some believe UBI encourages people to take job risks and stay in education because they have that money to fall back on, and there would also be more disposable income to spend in the economy. Others, however, believe that given the cost, there will either be government budget problems or inflation, both of which we don't want. On whether or not it's good for workers, some believe it empowers unpaid roles and prevents people from being exploited by giving them another source of income. Others, however, believe that it removes the incentive to work, encouraging laziness, which we don't want, particularly in a society built on meritocracy, and companies could use UBI as an excuse to pay lower wages, and if UBI can't keep up, it means people might actually be earning less. Then, is it good for the welfare state or not? Some believe it's good, because it removes the need for a complicated system. Everyone gets the same and everyone gets an amount of money that they can live off, removing the stigma of benefits and welfare and ensuring that everyone who needs it will guaranteed get it. Others, however, believe that UBI would be far more expensive and you're wasting money on people who don't need it. You could be funding a criminal's lifestyle. You could be paying healthy people the money that should have been gone to disabled people. And as such, there are far more unintended consequences than you might initially think. And finally, is it fair? Some argue it's fair because everyone receives the same amount. You get the same, so you can't say it's not fair. Others, however, believe that just because you get the same does not mean it's fair. You forget that people have to pay for this. And why should I pay for someone else to live at home all day? To some, that is not an idea of fairness. Overall, those supporting universal basic income believe that it is a very good and general solution to a number of issues in society. It can address poverty, it can address abusive relationships, it can address a number of issues by giving everyone a source of income to fall back on. It just creates that layer of security that many people lack today. Others, however, believe that it isn't justifiable, mainly given the cost. Not only is it unfair, but for such an expensive system, the benefits are not as clear-cut as you might want. It is unlikely we will see universal basic income come in anytime soon, simply because, again, it is very expensive, and at the moment most governments are already in too much debt to even consider it. Instead, we're seeing other policies, such as pushes to increase minimum wages, pushes to give more rights to workers, and to have companies stop avoiding paying tax. All of these don't necessarily address the core issue that universal basic income seeks to solve, but it is a first step towards creating a more equal and fair society. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments or on Twitter. Be sure to check back on Monday for another episode. Thank you all for listening, and I hope to see you soon.